You ever have one of those moments where your heart starts pounding before your brain even has a chance to catch up? I still remember that night like it was yesterday. I was in a taxi, somewhere in a part of town I didn't recognize, thinking it was just another ordinary ride home. Then, the driver leaned over, his face pale, voice trembling, and said, "Don't get out here, trust me." I laughed nervously at first. Maybe he was joking, maybe I was imagining it, but before I could even respond, headlights flashed all around us, and the unmistakable sound of police radios filled the air. That's when I realized, whatever was coming, there was no way to escape it calmly. Tonight, I want to take you through that harrowing experience, what happened, what I learned, and why sometimes, the smallest moments of intuition can save your life. I had just left my friend's house after a long evening of laughter and stories and warm tea and the kind of conversation that makes you forget about the ticking clock outside. I was walking down the dimly lit street and the air was cool against my skin and the city seemed to hum its familiar quiet rhythm like it had a pulse of its own. I hailed a taxi not thinking much of it, just another ordinary night, and I remember climbing into the backseat and sinking into the worn leather seat, feeling the comfort of routine and familiarity, feeling the sense of normalcy wash over me as the driver started the engine and we pulled away from the curb. I watched the streetlights blur past and thought about the conversation I had left behind and the comfort of my home waiting at the end of this ride. Nothing seemed unusual. I noticed the driver at first only in the periphery of my vision, a man in his 40s with graying hair at the temples and tired eyes, but I did not think much of it and I began to relax, letting the rhythm of the tires against the pavement lull me into a sense of ease. I reached for my phone and considered scrolling but decided instead to watch the street pass by. The city at night has a strange magic when you are alone in a taxi, and it makes you feel both invisible and exposed at the same time, as if you are in a world between worlds, between the safety of home and the uncertainty of the streets. The driver spoke a few words now and then, small talk, nothing that demanded attention, and I answered politely, and my mind wandered to things that seemed important at the moment, like the dinner I had enjoyed, the story my friend had told, the way the candles had flickered casting shadows that danced on the walls. And then I noticed a shift. I noticed the driver's eyes flicking constantly to the rearview mirror, and a tightness in his jaw that I had not seen before, and a stiffness in his posture that I could not ignore. I felt a flutter of unease, but I pushed it aside, convincing myself I was imagining it, convincing myself that the night was ordinary, that nothing could possibly go wrong in such a simple scenario. I told myself stories of comfort, of routine, but deep inside I knew something had changed. There was a subtle vibration in the air that I could feel in my chest and in the way my fingers gripped the edge of the seat, like a silent alarm sounding in a place you do not recognize. Yet I still tried to rationalize every feeling. I told myself the driver was probably just tired or worried about something unrelated, that it was nothing personal. I even smiled at him and tried to make conversation, but he seemed distant, his eyes darting from the road to the mirrors to the shadows outside and back to the road again, as if reading something I could not see, as if listening to something that I was not allowed to hear. It was then that he spoke, his words low and urgent, and I remember them as though etched in my memory in a way that nothing else from that night ever was. He said, "Do not get out here, trust me," and the panic in his voice was undeniable, and I froze in the seat. I felt my pulse quicken and the familiar rhythm of comfort vanished like smoke in the wind. I searched his face for a hint of jest or exaggeration, but there was none. His eyes were wide and serious, and the grip on the wheel was tight, as if he were holding on to something precious that he could not afford to lose. I realized in that instant that the ordinary evening I had planned had shifted into something else, something I could not yet name, and the city outside the window seemed to grow darker somehow, as if it too were holding its breath. The taxi slowed and I noticed the streets we were passing through were unfamiliar to me, and I began to feel the weight of vulnerability pressing down on my chest. I wanted to speak to him, to ask why, but the words would not form. I could feel the urgency of his warning vibrating in the space between us, and I understood that this was not a situation for conversation. This was a moment for listening and trusting, something I had rarely practiced in my life. I remembered stories my parents had told me about strangers who had sensed danger, about intuition that comes suddenly and cannot be ignored, and I realized that I was living one of those stories myself, and my heart pounded in my chest like a drumbeat marking a warning that could not be ignored. The night grew colder and the taxi turned down a narrow street lined with buildings that looked deserted and shadows that seemed to reach toward the car like fingers, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise, and a chill that had nothing to do with the air hit me suddenly. The driver did not speak again, but his eyes were fixed on the road and the mirrors and the street outside, and I felt the weight of unspoken fear settling around me. I thought about how ordinary moments can suddenly become extraordinary in ways we cannot predict, how a routine drive can shift into a memory that will follow you for years, and how the people we trust or ignore can hold the key to our survival. I thought about all the times I had ignored warnings or brushed off feelings of unease, and I realized how fragile our sense of security really is and how quickly it can vanish in a single instant as the world reminds you that it is not yours to control. I could feel my hands trembling in my lap, and I told myself to breathe, to remember that panic clouds judgment, that fear can make you see things that are not there. But deep down I knew this was different. This was not imagination. This was something real, something urgent, and the realization hit me that sometimes our lives are held in the quiet wisdom of others, in the instincts of strangers who sense what we cannot see and act before we even realize the danger exists. And I thought about the lives that could have been lost, the accidents that could have happened, the moments when people ignored warnings and paid the price, and I felt a mix of gratitude and terror for being alive at that moment in that taxi, watching the city blur past and feeling the tension grow with every turn of the wheel. Every shadow seemed to whisper secrets of the night, every flickering streetlight seemed to mark the passage of time differently, and I realized that life is often a series of ordinary moments punctuated by sudden revelations that change everything in an instant. I looked at the driver again, and I could see the faint sweat on his brow and the way his hands moved with purpose and urgency, and I understood that this man was not merely transporting me from one place to another. He was guiding me through a moment of unseen danger, through an invisible threat that only he could perceive, and I trusted him because I had no other choice, and because instinct told me that survival often depends on listening, even when it does not make sense, even when fear rises like a tide within you. And I let the words settle in my mind, do not get out here, trust me. And I let the silence stretch between us, thick with the knowledge that the night had shifted, that ordinary life had been replaced with something fragile and urgent, and that the story I would remember for the rest of my days had already begun. I sat back in my seat and felt the weight of the moment press against my chest, and I realized that the ordinary is only ordinary until the extraordinary chooses to reveal itself. And that night had chosen me, and the taxi and the driver and the city that seemed suddenly alive with warnings and whispers, and I knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again, because the moment had marked me in ways I could not yet understand. And I understood that sometimes the greatest lessons come not from preparation or planning, but from trusting the smallest instincts, from listening to voices trembling with urgency, from letting go of pride and allowing fear to teach you what it means to survive. And I sat there in that seat, heart racing, pulse pounding, hands gripping the edge of the seat, listening to the driver navigate the streets with careful precision. And I realized that life is made up of moments like this, ordinary evenings that become extraordinary memories, and that sometimes the line between safety and danger is as thin as a whispered warning from someone who cares enough to speak. And I promised myself that I would never forget the words that had saved me and the lesson that came with them, the night that began ordinary and ended unforgettable, the night that taught me about trust, fear, instinct, and the fragility of our everyday existence. And I knew that I would carry the memory of that drive with me for the rest of my life. There is a way that panic makes itself known that cannot be ignored. It creeps into your chest and your limbs and your mind in ways you cannot fully describe. It is not loud at first, not a siren, not a scream, not a shattering crash. It is subtle at first, a quickening of the pulse, a tightening of the stomach, a sudden awareness that something is off, and then it grows until it is a force that fills every corner of the moment, that makes your ears ring and your hands shake and your thoughts race faster than you can follow. I felt it that night, sitting in the backseat of a taxi, watching the streets slip past in a blur. I had thought the worst that could happen was perhaps getting lost or stuck in traffic, but when the driver's voice shook, when he leaned slightly toward me and said, do not get out here, trust me, I felt a cold jolt run through my body and a sudden sharp clarity that this was no ordinary evening, and I knew instinctively that his fear was not performative, it was real and it was urgent. I tried to study his face to find clues. I tried to tell myself that it might be anxiety or perhaps a personal issue unrelated to me, but the tightness in his jaw and the white knuckles on the steering wheel betrayed a level of concern that went far beyond mundane worry. I realized that sometimes fear is a language and sometimes it is a warning, and the way he spoke those words made it clear that the warning was meant for me as well. And in that instant my own sense of safety seemed to evaporate like morning mist under the sun. I remember the small details that night, the flicker of streetlights casting shadows that twisted and danced across the dashboard, the sound of tires rolling over uneven pavement, the occasional hum of a passing car that made the world feel simultaneously vast and claustrophobic, and the way the driver's eyes moved constantly between the mirrors and the road and the surrounding darkness, as if he were Reading some invisible text that only he could see. I watched his hands grip the wheel and release it in small measured movements, and I felt my own hands tighten in my lap. I wanted to ask questions, but the words would not form. The moment had a gravity that silenced conversation, and I knew that to speak was to break the fragile thread of understanding that had been established. In that brief warning I could feel my breath becoming shallow and rapid, my chest tightening as though some invisible weight pressed down upon it, and I understood with sudden force that this panic was not mine alone. It was shared. It was communicated through subtle cues and instincts that humans have used for millennia to survive the dangers that cannot be seen or named. I tried to recall times in my own life when I had ignored similar feelings, when something felt wrong, but I convinced myself it was fine or normal or safe, and I realized how easily the ordinary can lull you into a false sense of security, and how important it is to listen even when everything appears calm, even when your mind insists that this is ridiculous. And I remembered stories my parents and grandparents had told about intuition and gut feelings, about strangers who had warned them about unseen threats, about moments when listening had made the difference between life and death. I realized I was living one of those stories now, and the weight of it pressed down on me with an intensity that made my teeth ache and my stomach churn. And I understood that panic is not just an emotion, it is a signal, a guide, a way of communicating with the deepest parts of ourselves that recognize danger before the conscious mind can name it. I looked at the driver again, and I could see the sweat forming at his hairline, the subtle tremor in his hands, the way his eyes flicked nervously to the side streets as if he expected something to appear at any moment. I felt a strange sense of connection to him, a recognition that despite being strangers our lives were intertwined at that moment by the silent understanding of impending threat. I tried to calm myself with rational thoughts. I repeated silently the words, "It is probably nothing, it is just nerves, it is only a taxi ride." Yet the rational thoughts collided with the physical reaction of my body, which refused to be ignored. My heart pounded in a relentless rhythm, and a cold sweat gathered at the small of my back, and I knew with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic that his warning was real, and that the danger was imminent and invisible, and that my survival depended on paying attention to something I could not yet see. I noticed the way the city outside changed subtly, how the shadows seemed longer, how the alleys seemed darker, how the silence between passing cars seemed loaded with tension, and I felt the strange sensation of being hunted and protected at the same time, protected by the man whose voice trembled and hunted by an unknown force that pressed against the edges of perception. I realized that this panic was like a second layer of reality, like a hidden current beneath the surface of ordinary life that most people go through oblivious to it, and that only those attuned to subtle signals can perceive it. I felt my mind racing with questions. What was coming? What had he seen? What could happen? Why had I never been taught to recognize this language of fear? And I realized that these questions were meaningless because answers do not come in the moment of panic. The only thing that matters is attention, awareness, and action guided by instinct. I watched his eyes narrow slightly as he navigated a particularly dark stretch of road, and I could see his body stiffen and his jaw set, and I knew that whatever he was anticipating was approaching. I felt my own body respond automatically, my muscles tensing, my senses sharpening, every sound amplified, every shadow analyzed, and I understood that fear can be a teacher if you allow it to guide you rather than paralyze you. I thought about the countless times I had dismissed warnings from people and from my own intuition, times when I had ignored feelings of unease because I wanted to believe in comfort and routine, and I realized how many small miracles in life occur because someone paid attention, because someone acted on instinct, because someone did not dismiss the subtle signals that whisper danger in ways words cannot capture. I felt a mixture of gratitude and terror as I looked at the driver and realized that his panic had become my own. It had transferred through tone and movement and gaze, and I understood that sometimes human beings communicate more in silence and trembling voice and widened eyes than in any sentence or gesture designed to inform. I tried to quiet my mind, but the adrenaline made it impossible to rest. Thoughts ricocheted like stones in a canyon. What if this is the last ride? What if I never see home again? What if I have misjudged the situation? What if my life depended on a stranger whose fear I could not fully comprehend? Yet I knew that the fear itself was enough to make me cautious, to prepare me to listen to every small detail, to observe every shadow and every light and every movement of the taxi and of the streets and of the unknown spaces beyond the windows. I could feel my heart hammering and my stomach churning, and yet I also felt a strange clarity, a heightened sense of awareness that made every sense feel sharper, every sound louder, every movement of the city a potential clue. And I realized that panic is not weakness, it is a survival mechanism, a language of the body and mind that insists we pay attention when ordinary reason might fail. I watched the driver one more time and saw the faint quiver of his lips, the tight lines of worry etched on his face, the way He gripped the wheel with both hands as though holding on to life itself, and I understood that he was more than a taxi driver. He was a guardian for this moment, a messenger of unseen danger, and I trusted him fully, not because I understood but because instinct told me to, because the subtle power of fear was enough to demand obedience and attention. And I settled back into my seat, trembling and aware and utterly alive in a way that ordinary nights never allowed, my mind replaying his words over and over: "Do not get out here, trust me," and feeling the weight of their meaning press down on me. And I realized that the night had become a lesson in vigilance and intuition, and the world outside the windows was no longer ordinary but a place filled with hidden threats that only the careful and attentive could perceive. And I understood that this was one of those rare moments in life that leaves a permanent mark on your memory and shapes the way you understand fear, trust and survival. And I knew that even after the night ended, even after I reached home, even after the city returned to normal, I would carry the sensation of that moment, the tremor in his voice, the tension in his hands, the urgency that filled the small space of the taxi, as a permanent reminder that panic can be a guide, that fear can be a teacher, and that sometimes listening to it can make the difference between life and something far less certain. And I felt both grateful and humbled to have lived through it and to have learned the lesson in such a visceral, unignorable way. And then it happened. In an instant the ordinary rhythm of the ride shattered like glass underfoot, and the world shifted in a way that made my chest tighten and my mind race and my heart pound in a rhythm I had never felt before. We were rounding a corner on a street that seemed narrower than before. The buildings pressed closer together and the shadows became heavier and darker, and then the flash of lights hit us, a sudden blinding red and blue strobe that painted the taxi interior in a frantic kaleidoscope and made me flinch and cover my eyes before realizing that I could not escape the illumination no matter how tightly I squeezed them shut. The sound followed almost immediately, a high-pitched crackle of radios and indistinct but urgent chatter that grew louder with every passing second, and I realized that the world outside had become an arena of chaos and tension, and that we were at the center of it. And I felt my stomach drop as adrenaline surged and my senses went into overdrive, and every nerve in my body screamed that something was happening that could not be stopped and could not be ignored. The driver did not speak at first. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white and his eyes were wide in the rearview mirror, and I could see the rapid movement of his pupils as if he were reading an invisible map of danger and plotting a course through uncertainty. I tried to speak to him, but my voice felt small and brittle and insignificant, and when I opened my mouth only a choked sound came out, as if my body had forgotten how to form words. And I realized in that moment how powerless I felt, despite the fact that I was still sitting in a taxi seat only a few feet from the familiar leather and metal that usually gave me comfort. Now everything felt alien and threatening, and the city that had seemed so safe and familiar a few moments ago had transformed into a landscape of uncertainty and potential disaster. I glanced out the windows and saw the source of the lights. The police cars had arrived seemingly from nowhere, their engines silent now, but their presence immense, like sentinels of authority descending on the streets in precise formation, their strobe lights slicing through the night like knives, cutting through the fog and illuminating every alley, every shadow, every surface with a stark urgency. And I realized that we were surrounded, completely hemmed in by these symbols of law and order that in that moment seemed both terrifying and protective, and my mind raced trying to understand what had triggered such a response, what danger had been sensed, and why had it escalated so quickly. I watched the driver take a deep breath and shift the taxi slightly as if to position it more safely or to avoid drawing attention. I could not tell, and yet every movement was deliberate and calculated, and I felt an odd combination of fear and admiration for his ability to remain so focused under such pressure. And I understood that calmness in moments like this is not merely composure, it is survival. It is the difference between reacting with panic and reacting with purpose, and I felt the weight of that lesson press down on me with every heartbeat. The air in the taxi seemed heavier, as if the space had absorbed the tension from outside and wrapped it around us like a shroud, and I could feel the sweat forming at my temples and my neck and the small hairs on my arms standing on end as if responding to some invisible static charge that hummed with the energy of imminent confrontation. I tried to make sense of it logically. I tried to reassure myself that it was a mistake, that the police presence was unrelated to us, that perhaps there had been a minor incident down the street and we were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. But reason failed me because instinct screamed louder and my body refused to accept the comforting words my mind wanted to offer. The sound of radio chatter became clearer and I could make out fragments of sentences, names, locations, numbers, numbers that were meaningless to me but conveyed the urgency of the situation to those on the outside, and I realized that there was an entire world of coordinated action taking place just beyond the windows and that we were uncomfortably close to its epicenter. I could feel my hands trembling in my lap and I clenched them together until they ached, trying to impose some sense of control on a situation that offered none. And the driver spoke again in a low voice, almost a whisper but forceful. "Do not move," he said, and I obeyed immediately, as if the very act of breathing or shifting might trigger something catastrophic. And I realized how fragile our lives can be, how quickly ordinary nights can transform into situations where the smallest decision can have enormous consequences. I thought about every movie and story I had ever seen where the protagonist realizes too late that they are caught in a trap, and I shivered because now I was living one of those stories in real time, and there was no rewind, no pause, no director to cut to a safer scene. And the knowledge that this was real and irreversible filled me with a mixture of terror and fascination. And the taxi interior seemed impossibly small, like a cage, yet also protective, because the driver had anticipated this moment, and I understood that our safety depended entirely on his experience, his judgment, his instincts. I could hear the faint sound of sirens approaching in the distance. Reinforcements maybe, or perhaps part of the same operation, and every flicker of light reflected on the buildings made the night feel alive with intent, like the city itself was aware of us and of the events unfolding within it. And I felt a deep shiver crawl up my spine as my imagination filled in scenarios both plausible and impossible of what might have led to this and what could happen next. I watched the driver's hands again on the wheel, the precision of his movements, the way his shoulders tensed and relaxed, and I realized that he was calm despite the panic around us, because he had prepared for this moment in a way that I could not understand, and that this calm was not absence of fear but mastery of it. And I felt a strange sense of reassurance in that knowledge, because in life moments of extreme danger are rarely survived by those who panic but by those who act with measured purpose. And I realized that the night was teaching me this lesson in a visceral, unforgettable way. My mind oscillated between fear and curiosity. I tried to guess what had happened to require such a heavy police presence, what kind of threat could elicit this kind of immediate action, and I considered every possibility, from criminal activity to an accident to something more sinister. And I understood that in that moment speculation was meaningless, because our role was simply to stay still, observe, and trust the guidance of someone who had both the awareness and the courage to navigate this moment. I could feel the tension building in my chest and the sense of time stretching and slowing down, and every second felt like a minute, and every movement of the taxi became monumental. And I realized that the night had suspended ordinary reality and replaced it with a heightened state where survival instincts were paramount, and I was completely immersed in it, and I felt alive in a way that ordinary days never allowed. I glanced at the mirrors again and saw the reflections of flashing lights multiplied in every direction. The street signs illuminated and distorted the interior of the taxi, and I could see my own wide-eyed reflection staring back at me, and I understood that in that instant I was fully present, with no distractions, no illusions, no escape, just awareness and vulnerability. And I felt a strange gratitude for being able to witness it, even as terror coursed through me. The minutes stretched on, and the sounds of distant voices and radios and engines created a symphony of tension that filled every corner of my awareness. And I understood that this moment would remain etched in my memory forever, that it would define a standard of fear and focus that ordinary life rarely demands. And I marveled at how quickly our world can shift from normalcy to chaos, and how little control we have over such transformations, and yet how much our actions and attention matter when the unexpected arrives. The driver did not speak again for a while, but his movements remained precise and deliberate, and I realized that trust in moments like these is everything, that the only thing we could do was stay still, breathe minimally, and let someone who understood the situation guide us through the storm that had appeared out of nowhere. And I felt an odd sense of connection to him, the bond of shared urgency and mutual reliance that is formed in moments of extreme pressure. And I understood why stories of strangers saving lives and intuitive reactions are repeated across generations, because in those moments humanity shines through fear and uncertainty. And I felt privileged and terrified at once to be a part of such a raw unfolding of events. The lights continued to flash around us, and I could hear footsteps approaching the taxi doors from the police. I could hear muffled voices issuing commands, and the sound seemed both alien and authoritative. And I realized that we were about to enter the next phase of this ordeal, where action would be required, and I felt every nerve in my body tense for it. And I reminded myself to follow instructions, to remain calm, and to observe carefully, because panic now would have consequences. I realized that ordinary nights can vanish in a heartbeat, and that extraordinary moments often arrive without warning, and I felt both humbled and alive to be experiencing it in real time. And I understood that this night would stay with me forever, marking a boundary between the mundane and the Unforgettable between safety and chaos, between fear and survival, and I resolved silently to remember every sensation, every detail, every lesson that the police cars and flashing lights and trembling voices had imprinted on me, because sometimes life only teaches in the language of immediacy and vulnerability, and that is a language worth remembering. In moments like that, time seems to stretch and contract all at once, and the world outside the taxi became both infinitely large and impossibly small at the same time. I realized that the ordinary rules I had relied upon my whole life could no longer be trusted, and that instinct was suddenly more important than reason, more important than habit, more important than any plan I had ever made. I watched the driver carefully shifting the car slightly, as if maneuvering through invisible minefields, and I realized that he trusted something beyond the obvious, something I could not see, and it made me reflect on all the times I had ignored my own instincts in favor of comfort or pride or stubbornness, how often I had dismissed the little voice in the back of my mind warning me that something was off, or that a decision was dangerous, or that a situation was not as safe as it appeared, and I felt a pang of regret for all the times I had ignored the small inner signals that were meant to guide me, and I realized that in this moment I had no choice but to let go of my skepticism and to trust without question the instincts of someone who had seen more than I could see and understood more than I could understand. I felt a shiver run down my spine as the taxi edged forward carefully, and the flashing lights of the police illuminated the street in a strobe of red and blue, and I realized that trust is not always about certainty, it is often about surrender. It is about acknowledging that you do not have all the information, that you cannot predict the outcome, and that the only way to navigate some situations is to place your confidence in someone else's judgment and to follow it without hesitation. I thought about every time I had questioned someone else's warning or ignored advice, thinking that I knew better or that the danger was exaggerated, and I realized how foolish and vulnerable that mindset could be, how dangerous it can be to rely solely on your own assessment when the stakes are unknowable and shifting, and I felt a sense of humility wash over me, because the night had stripped away all pretense of control and left only awareness and action guided by instinct and experience. I could see the driver's eyes scanning constantly the dark alleys and side streets, every mirror and reflection, every movement in the shadows, and I felt the subtle power of observation and intuition in action. I understood that his fear was not weakness, it was information. It was a tool, a finely tuned mechanism honed by experience that allowed him to anticipate and respond in ways I could not even imagine, and I realized that instinct is a form of knowledge deeper than any calculation or logic. It is a connection to the unseen patterns of the world that we often dismiss because we prefer comfort to awareness. I felt a mix of awe and terror as I reflected on how much of life is lived ignoring instinct, how often people convince themselves that reason alone is enough, and how quickly reason fails when the world presents threats that are not immediately visible or explainable. I noticed the way my own body responded to his calm despite the panic in the air, how my muscles, though tense, began to mimic his careful control, how my breathing, though shallow, attempted to synchronize with his focus, how my mind, though racing, was gradually surrendering to observation rather than conjecture, and I realized that survival in moments like these is as much about psychological alignment as it is about physical action. It is about trusting another human being completely even when you cannot understand the full scope of the danger, and it is about trusting the instincts that have been honed by experience beyond words or measurement. I remembered stories my grandmother used to tell me about her own instincts, about people and situations, about times when listening to that small inner warning had kept her safe, and I understood now that instinct is both personal and collective. It is something passed down in subtle ways through observation, experience, and shared humanity. It is the way people have survived disasters, wars, accidents, and crimes throughout history, by paying attention to signals that were not always obvious and acting without hesitation. I realized that in the taxi I was participating in that tradition of trust and instinct. I was witnessing it in real time, and I was learning its value in the most visceral way possible. My senses heightened, my mind alert, my body ready to react to every subtle change. I could feel the sweat on my forehead and the ache in my shoulders, and yet a strange calm had settled in my chest because I had surrendered to the guidance of someone who knew what to do even though I did not, and I understood that surrendering does not mean weakness. It means recognition of limits and acknowledgement of expertise and intuition that exceeds your own understanding. I watched the driver glance at me briefly out of the rearview mirror, and I could see in his eyes the same message, the unspoken command to trust fully, to do nothing but observe and follow, to let go of fear and embrace awareness, and I obeyed immediately without thinking, without question, because instinct in that moment demanded obedience, not debate. And and I felt the weight of the lesson press upon me more intensely than anything I had learned in my life before. I thought about how often people ignore advice or warnings because pride gets in the way, how often they dismiss the fear of others as overreaction or cowardice, and I realized that moments like these are the exceptions that prove the rule, that humility and attentiveness can be life-saving and that pride and arrogance can be deadly. I noticed every detail of the street, the reflections of flashing lights on the windows, the subtle movement of shadows, the way the taxi's engine hummed in contrast to the silence of the city around us, the small sounds that seemed insignificant but carried meaning for someone who knew what to look for, and I felt my own attention sharpen with each passing second. I realized that survival requires awareness, and that awareness requires listening to instinct even when logic cannot explain it, even when reason would suggest that everything is fine, and I felt a deep gratitude for the presence of the driver and for his ability to act decisively and calmly in a situation that was unfolding faster than most people could comprehend. I thought about how ordinary life often dulls instinct, how routine makes people complacent, and how rare it is to experience a moment where instinct and attention must be heightened to such an extraordinary degree, and I felt a strange exhilaration in addition to the fear, because I was awake in a way that I rarely am, fully present, fully alive, fully conscious of every detail and every sensation, and I realized that moments like this are not just about surviving the night, they are about learning to listen to the world in a deeper way, to recognize the subtle patterns and signals that most ignore, and to act decisively when the opportunity presents itself. I watched the police cars still flashing around us, the shadows moving and shifting, and I felt my body respond automatically to cues I could not consciously name. I realized that the world communicates constantly if you pay attention, and that instincts are a form of translation for that communication, and I marveled at how much could be conveyed through tone, posture, gaze, and subtle motion without a single word being spoken. I reflected on how the taxi driver had communicated urgency without panic, how he had demonstrated authority without aggression, and how he had guided me through the unknown with nothing but observation and instinct, and I realized that the most profound lessons in life are sometimes taught silently and subtly, and that fear, when harnessed and respected, can be more informative than logic. I felt a deep sense of humility as I recognized that my own life had been largely insulated from real danger until this moment, and I understood that trust and instinct are not abstract ideas, they are tools and armor in the unpredictable theater of life, and that the ability to surrender to them can be the difference between survival and disaster. I watched the driver as we navigated the maze of flashing lights and looming shadows, and I knew that I would carry the memory of his focus, his calm, his instinctive knowledge for the rest of my life, and that the lesson of trusting someone's instincts when reason fails would remain with me forever as a marker of wisdom gained in a moment of extraordinary danger. And I realized that in life it is not always the loudest voices or the clearest plans that guide you to safety, but the quiet authority of instinct and experience, and the courage to trust it fully without hesitation or doubt. And I felt my pulse slow just slightly as I acknowledged this truth and prepared myself for whatever might come next, knowing that I had already learned one of the most important lessons of my life. Fear has a way of creeping into your life quietly, at first almost unnoticeable, almost polite in the way it touches your senses, and then it grows, it blooms in your chest, it coils around your thoughts, and suddenly the world you thought you knew feels fragile and uncertain. And I realized that night in the taxi that fear is both a warning and a teacher, that it carries lessons wrapped in tension, in the pounding of your heart, in the trembling of your hands, and in the sharp intake of your breath when everything you thought was safe and predictable suddenly shifts into the unknown. I had always thought of fear as something to be conquered, something to push aside with logic or reassurance or humor, and I realized in that moment that I had misunderstood it, that fear is not your enemy, it is a guide, a messenger that insists you pay attention when ordinary reasoning fails, and that the lesson it brings is not comfortable but necessary. I could feel my body alive in a way I had never experienced before, every nerve heightened, every muscle alert, every sense stretching to capture details that previously went unnoticed, the reflections of police lights on windows, the subtle movement of shadows in alleyways, the low hum of engines in the distance. Every sound and sight carried meaning, and I realized that fear had sharpened my perception in a way calm and complacency never could. I thought about all the times I had dismissed warning signs, the small intuitions that whispered caution, the gut feelings that I had silenced because I thought they were irrational or trivial, and I felt a pang of regret for having ignored them. But I also understood that that the human mind is not trained to always heed fear, to recognize the subtle language it speaks, and that sometimes it takes an extraordinary situation to teach you how to listen and interpret what the body and mind are trying to communicate. I noticed how the taxi driver embodied this lesson completely, his hands steady despite the tremor in his voice, his eyes scanning constantly for threats both seen and unseen, his posture alert and ready to respond, and I realized that his calm was not the absence of fear but mastery of it, the ability to let fear guide action without succumbing to panic. And I understood that this is the distinction between those who survive and those who falter, between those who navigate danger and those who are overwhelmed by it. I reflected on how fear has shaped human survival throughout history, how countless generations have survived calamities, wars, accidents, and disasters by paying attention to instinctive signals that the conscious mind often ignores, how animals respond to subtle cues, and how humans have adapted similar patterns to preserve life. I realized that the lesson I was learning in that taxi was not unique to me, that it was part of a larger tradition of listening to fear and translating it into action, that the trembling voice of a stranger warning you of danger is part of that same continuum of instinct and awareness, and that responding appropriately can be the difference between safety and catastrophe. I could feel my heart racing and my mind analyzing simultaneously, trying to make sense of what was happening and to extract meaning from every movement and sound, and yet there was also an underlying surrender and acceptance that some things cannot be fully understood in the moment, and that fear demands trust and action even when clarity is absent. I thought about how often people live their lives in a state of false security, relying solely on routines, plans, and assurances from others, and how quickly all of that can evaporate when the unexpected arrives. And I realized that fear is the universe's way of reminding us that control is largely an illusion, and that awareness and responsiveness are far more valuable than certainty or comfort. I could see the reflections of flashing police lights painting the interior of the taxi in alternating red and blue colors, and I felt the surreal nature of the moment, the way ordinary reality had been replaced by heightened perception and raw immediacy, and I understood that fear had opened my senses to a level of attentiveness that calm could never achieve, and that this was a rare and invaluable gift. I noticed the subtle changes in the driver's demeanor, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his shoulders shifted as he anticipated movements beyond my perception, and I realized that mastery of fear requires both vigilance and calm. It requires acknowledging the presence of danger without letting it dominate your judgment, without allowing it to cloud action, and that this is a skill that can only be honed through experience and practice, and that some people possess it innately while others learn it through trial and circumstance. I felt a sense of gratitude toward him for demonstrating that lesson, for showing me in real time how fear can be harnessed, how it can teach us to observe more closely, to act more decisively, and to appreciate the fragility and value of life. I reflected on my own life and how much of it I had spent trying to avoid fear, how often I had sought comfort over awareness, how often I had dismissed the subtle alarms of my body and mind because they interfered with convenience or pride, and I understood that the night in the taxi had provided a radical re-education in the importance of listening to instinct and fear alike. I could feel the tension in my own body easing slightly, not because the danger had passed but because I had begun to internalize the lesson that fear is informative and actionable, that it is not to be feared itself but respected, understood, and translated into careful observation and measured responses. I thought about the small details that I might have missed if fear had not heightened my senses, the flicker of movement in a shadowy doorway, the slight misalignment of a street sign reflecting a light I had not expected, the low hum of tires over uneven pavement. All of these things became meaningful in a way they would never have been if my mind had been dulled by false security, and I realized that the lesson extends far beyond that night. It extends into all moments of life, into every decision that carries risk, into every situation where complacency can be dangerous, and it made me understand that living fully and safely requires a partnership with fear, not a denial of it. I could feel the taxi moving slowly and deliberately, guided by the driver's precise understanding of the streets and the unfolding situation, and I marveled at his ability to translate fear into action without succumbing to panic. I realized that the human mind is capable of remarkable adaptation in moments of stress, that when fear is present the body and brain heighten their ability to process information, to react to stimuli, to make decisions rapidly and with clarity that under normal circumstances would be impossible, and that this is one of the great gifts of survival instincts. I reflected on the difference between fear as an obstacle and fear as a teacher, and I understood that the taxi driver had taught me through example how to transform fear from from a paralyzing emotion into a guiding principle, how to let it sharpen perception, guide action, and provide lessons that endure long after the moment has passed. I could feel the tension of the night settling into a pattern, a rhythm, a dance of anticipation and action, and I realized that the lesson of fear is continuous, that it never truly ends, that each experience builds upon the last, teaching you more about awareness, responsiveness, and humility. And I felt an appreciation for the role that fear has played in my own life even before this night, how it had subtly warned me in small ways if I had been paying attention, how it had shaped my choices, and how, if heeded correctly, it can protect and guide us in ways logic alone cannot. I thought about the responsibility that comes with understanding fear, how it is not merely a personal tool but a communal one, how paying attention to the fear and intuition of others can save lives, how communication through warning and response is a critical part of human survival. And I understood that the trembling voice of the taxi driver had been more than just a caution, it had been a bridge between instinct and action, between awareness and safety. And I realized that sometimes the simplest warnings carry the deepest lessons, and that by listening carefully we honor the experience and foresight of those around us, and we ensure that we navigate the world more safely, more wisely, and more consciously. And I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the night, for the fear, for the lesson, for the driver, for the invisible dangers and the visible lights. And I knew that I would carry this understanding with me forever, that fear, when respected and heeded, is not a sign of weakness but of intelligence, courage, and survival, that it is one of life's most powerful teachers, and that the memory of this night would continue to remind me to listen to the subtleties, the tremors, the whispers of instinct that guide us through both ordinary and extraordinary moments, and that by learning from fear we learn to live more fully and attentively. And I felt the weight and the blessing of that truth pressing gently but insistently on my mind and soul as the taxi moved carefully through the night, and the lesson settled into me permanently. Eventually the tension of the night began to shift from acute terror to cautious relief as the taxi moved through the streets guided by the driver's careful hand, and I realized that we were moving towards some resolution, though the exact nature of it remained unknown. And I could feel the adrenaline slowly ebbing from my body, leaving behind a residue of alertness and reflection that made every detail feel sharper, every sound more pronounced, every shadow more meaningful. And I understood that these were the moments when lessons are truly absorbed, when the immediate danger begins to recede but the imprint of experience remains indelible. I looked at the driver again, and I could see the fatigue etched into his face, the faint tremor still present in his hands, the tightness around his eyes, and I understood that the ordeal had affected him too, that he had carried the weight of vigilance for both of us, and that this shared responsibility had bonded us in a silent understanding that transcended words. I thought about the police presence and the flashing lights that had surrounded us, the urgency in their movements, the precise coordination, and I realized that the world is full of unseen systems operating just beyond our perception, and that sometimes our lives intersect with them in ways that are sudden and profound, and that surviving those intersections requires trust, awareness, and humility. I could feel the pulse in my temples and the tension in my shoulders slowly unwinding, though I remained alert, aware of every nuance in the environment, and I understood that moments like this leave a permanent mark on the psyche that ordinary reflection cannot replicate, and that the memory of heightened awareness and fear carries with it lessons that ordinary calm cannot impart. I thought about the ordinary assumptions I had carried into the night, the sense that routine and familiarity were sufficient to ensure safety, and I realized how fragile those assumptions are, how quickly ordinary life can be disrupted, and how important it is to remain vigilant and responsive even in the most familiar settings. I reflected on the role of the driver and the trust that had been necessary for both of us to navigate the night safely, the way his instincts guided our movements, the way his fear translated into action, and the way his calm presence provided a framework within which I could orient myself. And I understood that trust is not merely a social construct, it is a survival tool, and that learning to trust the instincts and expertise of others can be as critical as honing your own awareness. I considered the lessons fear had imparted to me during the night, how it had sharpened perception, heightened senses, taught me to notice subtleties that would otherwise go unnoticed, and I understood that the memory of this experience would continue to influence my life in ways both conscious and unconscious, guiding decisions, attention, and response to danger long after the immediate threat had passed. I could feel a mixture of gratitude and awe swelling within me, gratitude for having survived the night, for having been guided by someone more aware and experienced, for having been forced into a level of consciousness and attentiveness that most people rarely experience, and awe at the fragility and unpredictability of life, the way ordinary routines can be disrupted in an instant, and the way human beings are capable of extraordinary focus and calm under pressure. I reflected on the invisible network of instincts and intuition that govern human behavior, how small observations, small reactions can ripple outward to ensure safety or cause harm harm, how paying attention to the warnings of others can be life-saving, and I understood that this is one of the deeper truths of existence, that our survival often depends not solely on our own abilities but on the ability to observe, understand and respond to the instincts and experiences of those around us. I could feel the hum of the taxi engine and the subtle movements of the vehicle as it responded to the driver's guidance, and I realized that every motion was a lesson in careful navigation and controlled response, that the way he maneuvered through streets that seemed deceptively ordinary was evidence of a mind trained to anticipate danger and act decisively, and that observation of such mastery was itself instructive. I thought about the ordinary days that would follow this night, the return to comfort, routines, familiarity, and I realized that nothing would feel quite ordinary again, that the memory of heightened awareness, the lessons of fear, the trust in instinct would linger and influence the way I perceive the world moving forward, and I felt a sense of responsibility to honor that experience by remaining attentive, by acknowledging the subtle signals of the environment, and by never underestimating the value of instinct and preparation. I reflected on the fragile balance between calm and panic, the thin line that separates ordinary life from extraordinary danger, and I understood that the night had revealed not only the presence of threat but also the power of composed action to navigate it, that panic alone is useless while carefully measured response informed by instinct and experience is vital, and that this principle extends far beyond a single night or a single taxi ride. I could feel a profound respect for the forces, both visible and invisible, that had shaped the events, the coordination of the police, the anticipation of the driver, the randomness of circumstance, and I realized that life is a tapestry of unseen influences, and that our role is often to navigate it with awareness and responsiveness, and that recognition of this interconnectedness fosters humility and gratitude. I thought about the lessons that fear imparts about life, about the fragility of safety, about the importance of vigilance, about the need for trust, and I understood that these lessons are ongoing, that they do not end when the immediate threat recedes, that the memory of the night would continue to inform my choices, attention and perception, and I felt a deep sense of awe at the continuity of learning that arises from experience. I could feel my own body relaxing incrementally as the adrenaline left my system, the tension easing from my muscles, the rapid heartbeat slowing, and I realized that the body carries both the memory and the lesson of fear in ways that are subtle and permanent, that the physiological response is intertwined with psychological understanding, and that the combination of the two creates lasting insight. I reflected on the importance of gratitude in moments like these, the gratitude for life, for survival, for guidance, for the presence of people who act decisively when danger appears, and I understood that gratitude is not merely an emotional response, it is a recognition of interconnectedness, the acknowledgement that others play roles in our survival, that the world is rarely navigated in isolation, and that appreciation for those roles strengthens awareness and empathy. I noticed the city around us, the way shadows no longer seemed menacing now that the immediate danger had passed, the way the flashing lights receded into distance, and I felt a renewed sense of connection to the environment, to the people who inhabit it, and to the invisible forces that shape our lives, and I realized that reflection after fear is as important as the instinctive response during it, that taking the time to process the experience and extract meaning is what transforms terror into wisdom. I thought about the lasting impact of such nights, how memory preserves the heightened awareness and the lessons of instinct, how these experiences shape future reactions and decisions, and I felt a sense of solemnity at the weight of this knowledge, that this night would remain with me permanently and inform my life in ways both overt and subtle. I considered the balance between humility and confidence, the way survival requires both acknowledgement of limits and trust in the expertise of others, and I realized that the night had taught me more about human behavior, perception and awareness than any classroom or book could convey. I felt a profound respect for the ordinary moments that can suddenly become extraordinary, for the way life can pivot on a single event, for the subtle signals that guide us toward safety, and I understood that this awareness is a gift that comes at a cost of anxiety, tension and recognition of vulnerability. I reflected on the taxi driver again, the quiet hero of the night, the person who had translated fear into action, who had guided both of us safely through uncertainty, and I felt gratitude for his calm alertness, for his knowledge, for his willingness to act decisively, and I understood that ordinary people can have extraordinary impact when circumstances demand it. I could feel my mind replaying the events in sequence, noting details I might have missed, the slight movements of the driver's hands, the flicker of light on pavement, the sounds in the distance, and I realized that such meticulous observation is itself a survival tool that we can carry forward into daily life. I reflected on how fear can teach empathy, how understanding the source and reason for someone else's panic or caution can inform our responses and enhance cooperation, and I understood that the night had reinforced the value of attention to others and awareness of subtle cues that can save lives. I thought about the fragility of ordinary routines, the ease with which life can change, and I understood that each day carries potential for both danger and insight, and that cultivating awareness is a lifelong practice that transforms fear from paralyzing force into guiding principle. I could feel the taxi slowing as we approached familiar streets, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering tension, the knowledge that we were approaching safety and the awareness that the lessons of fear, trust and instinct would remain with me indefinitely. And I understood that this night had become a permanent part of my consciousness, a story of vigilance, courage and human connection that would inform my perception and decisions for the rest of my life. And I felt a deep sense of gratitude for having lived through it, for having observed it, and for having learned from it in real time, knowing that survival is not merely a matter of chance but of attention, trust and the wisdom to act when fear speaks.